When I was 8 years old, I went to Disney World with my parents and my sister. It was the first time that everyone but my dad had visited another country, and since we were flying all the way to Orlando, Florida, it was a big leap since the only holidays we'd had before this involved a 2-hour car ride to the coast. Of course, we were all excited. America was new to us all, and we were going to what is arguably to this day the best theme park in the world. We were staying for 2 weeks, so we had plans to visit other places too, such as Universal Studios, the Kennedy Space Center, SeaWorld, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and so forth. But Disney World was the big one. It was like nothing we had ever experienced before. It was a world unto itself, where the worries and stress that came with your daily life didn't matter. Every inch of this huge plot of land is designed to bring you joy. The friendly employees who go out of their way to make your day better, and the mascots who do their best to make sure that you believe that they're the real characters. The rides are a marvelous feat in engineering, made in such a way that the average person couldn't possibly comprehend how they accomplish such things, as they immerse you into an experience that no theme park ride anywhere else in this world could compete with. Personally, I loved Epcot Center more than the Magic Kingdom. It felt educational, but at the same time it was impressive in the way that it would teach you. It had cultural representation from across the world, which may have not been entirely accurate, but it was still interesting for my young mind to experience. More than anything though, it felt like I'd stepped into the future, and that's no surprise since Epcot was quite literally designed to be an interpretation of a utopian future, its name being an acronym for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. My memories of that trip, and Disney World in particular, will always stay near and dear to me. It had such a profound effect that when we were at the airport about to fly back to England, I, my mother, and my sister cried knowing that we had to leave. I haven't been back to Disney World since then. I'm an adult now with limited disposable income, so I could go there with my wife whenever I wanted to. We also live in America, so the cost of travel there wouldn't be too high. I've sometimes thought that it might be nice to revisit Disney World, to experience that sense of wonder once more, and visit Epcot Center to see into the future once more. There's a problem though, and that is that I'm older now. I've learned a lot about the world and how things work, but most notably, I've learned about Disney. I've learned that they own hundreds of assets, including a third of the US film industry, that the employees at Disney World and all its other parks are underpaid and overworked. I've learned about its history of discrimination towards women and minorities, how they've threatened to sue a daycare center for having a mural of their characters in it, or how they didn't allow a 4-year-old boy to have an image of Spider-Man on his tombstone after he died from leukemia. Despite the fact that Disney has played a huge role in pretty much everyone's childhood, it's hard to uphold the romantic image of them in your head, that they're simply a company that's only intention is to make children happy. They're a colossus, intent on devouring as many companies as they can to grow to an even more incomprehensible size than they already are, happily stepping on the lives of its workers and siphoning money from its consumers in exchange for mangled imitations of their childhood memories. Eventually, it dawned on me. I can't go back to Disney World. If I want to keep that memory in my head of how it felt to be there as a child, I have no choice but to stay away from it, or risk tainting one of the most precious moments of my life. I don't want to see the stormtroopers from Star Wars marching around the park. I don't want to know how vastly overpriced the concession stands are. I don't want to think about how the person in the Donald Duck costume is roasting alive in the Florida heat. As much as I believe that knowing all of these awful things about Disney is good and necessary, there's part of me that wants to be selfish and keep that moment of my life where I had nothing to worry about alive, and no amount of nostalgia could possibly compare to it. I can't go back to Disney World, and neither can you. In the past few years, the general public has developed an intense love affair with nostalgia. This has been made evident by the absurd amount of media content that's been produced, whether that's remakes, reboots, spiritual successors, revivals of long dormant franchises, or even existing franchises which seem to be forever ongoing, such as the Marvel or Star Wars extended universe. There's also been an influx of brand new media that's designed to scratch your nostalgic itch by being based in the past. And in some cases, there are products that feel like they've been designed from the ground up to reward audiences for recognizing past properties. There's even a wide selection of video game franchises that have been revived and remade, some of which have had drastic overhauls compared to their original, whereas less older revivals have been given a simple visual upgrade to meet the standards of modern hardware, but this has had some mixed results. Nostalgic properties appeal to an audience's need for familiarity, comfort, and even validate your personal emotional investment in media. Of course, movies and TV shows aren't created out of the goodness of a producer's heart to make people happy. Just like with any other form of media on the mass market, the desire for profit always takes precedent to artistic expression. And this is the key reason why we've been seeing such a vast amount of productions that are designed to appeal to that familiarity. That familiarity works to the advantage of content producers though. Marketing an original intellectual property, or IP, is a risky and costly endeavor, and it's something that which major studios have become skittish about. Media has also informed our expectations of the future as well. Throughout the 80s in particular, it was extremely common to see movies which tried to envision the kind of world that we would live in the future, whether that be utopian or dystopian. It also wasn't uncommon to see the inclusion of futuristic technologies, many of which people thought we'd never see in our lifetimes, but a good amount of them have come to fruition, and in some cases better than their past portrayals. However, even though we have these amazing technologies and more, the conditions in which we've been given them are less than favourable, and usage of them often involves some ethically murky catch, such as allowing the manufacturer to sell and use your personal information as they see fit. Nostalgia clearly has its positives and negatives. Sometimes we'll experience something that scratches our itch in the right ways, but despite the growing cynicism towards it, what with the litany of underwhelming or failed revivals of certain franchises, the public always seems to want more, even if it means possibly being let down. Ultimately, I want to ask, what are the underlying reasons behind our love of nostalgia? In what ways could it be potentially damaging? Why is it that younger generations, namely Gen Z, Millennials, and to some extent Generation X, are its largest consumers? Why are we so enamored with the portrayals of the future found in old movies? Most importantly though, I want to address why our love of nostalgia is symptomatic of our fears for the future, and how returning to the past has become a popular way in which we can forget about the struggles that we face in our daily lives, from anything as personal to work to something as existential as an impending climate catastrophe. To properly assess our ongoing obsession with nostalgia, I first want to talk about how the media facilitates and encourages our desire to attach ourselves and even our identities to movies and TV shows, and how the fact that their staggering mass appeal is emblematic for our ravenous desire for familiarity and nostalgia. I think it's safe to say that at this point in time we've been exposed to an overwhelming amount of nostalgic media and properties. Most of the movies that we've seen released in the past few years have either been sequels from existing franchises, spin-offs, reboots, or remakes. This can also include the relatively recent phenomenon of extended universes based on a franchise, most notably Marvel and Star Wars. Regardless of the form of media that you consume, you'll have some way of being involved in a franchise. You can go to the movie theater to watch the tentpole blockbuster films that serve as a nexus in which all of these stories converge, much as the Avengers movies and the episodic Star Wars entries, but if you wish, you can also immerse yourself deeper in the lore and backstories of tertiary characters that exist within these universes, such examples being Loki, WandaVision, or The Mandalorian, each of which contains plot lines that are linked to the main movies but exist to either complement the universe or to be enjoyed as its own entity. All of these things exist on the appeal of familiarity, whether they're an imitation of something you love or simply based in the worlds that you've seen previously. One other successful franchise revival has been the Transformers movies, directed by Michael Bay, a man who's blown up more people and vehicles than the US military and doesn't believe in the existence of tripods. Transformers as a franchise was originally conceived as a way to sell toys to children in the 80s, but when they grew up, they got another opportunity to see it again, this time being realized as high-budget movies where you can barely tell what's happening. Given that the audience for Transformers were now adults with disposable income, it also gave the studio the opportunity to stuff each new entry with an ungodly amount of product placements, many of which being about as subtle as one of the Paul brothers in a monastery. Speaking of unsubtle product placements, I would like to talk about this video's sponsor, NordVPN. Admit it, you didn't see that coming, did you? I personally believe that everyone should be using a VPN pretty much all the time. Privacy is important to me, and I'm sure it's just as important to you too. Later we're going to talk some more about that, but right now I want to say that when you're browsing the internet just doing regular things, your personal information is being given away without you knowing it. NordVPN allows you to protect your information from would-be hackers or even large tech companies who know all about your crippling ASMR addiction. It's excellent for staying protected when you're on open Wi-Fi networks too. So when you buy the cheapest thing on the menu at the coffee shop so you can use their internet for free for hours, you don't have anything to worry about other than avoiding the judgmental gaze of the baristas. NordVPN is a great and simple way to keep yourself protected online. By routing your connection from a choice of over 5,200 servers across 60 countries, so you can connect somewhere close to you just for some protection, or you can connect to another country to unlock parts of the internet that otherwise wouldn't be available to you. Observe. When I connect to a server in the UK, I get access to shows and movies on Netflix that aren't available in the US, such as Gogglebox, an absurdly popular reality television show about people watching television. What, did you think that British TV was all David Attenborough documentaries and Doctor Who? No, we produce a lot of trash, like a lot, and it's popular. Just look at Love Island. They do have some actual good stuff on there though that you can't get in the US, FYI. You can also use it across multiple platforms, including iOS, Android, macOS, and much more. So you can remain connected and protected on all of your devices. So here's the deal. If you want to go to nordvpn.com/Salari, with the 2-year plan you can get 4 months absolutely free, which is an overall 73% saving. And as someone who subscribed to NordVPN over a year ago, I can safely say that it is absolutely worth the money. So yeah, go for it. Links in the description, and while you're at it, thank them for supporting the channel. Well, don't do that, they're probably busy. I don't know, maybe send them a tweet. I'm not your boss, just do what you want. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. Familiar media franchises, both old and new, are popular and successful, and I mean really successful. In 2019, only 2 of the top 20 highest grossing films in the box office weren't based on an existing movie franchise or adapted from other mediums such as comic books. Those 2 movies were Us by director Jordan Peele and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by director Quentin Tarantino. The top 10 movies from that year were all existing franchises, 7 of which were owned and distributed by Disney, something that we'll talk about soon. In 2020, however, we did see more variety in the kind of films that perform well in the box office. Although there was no shortage in movies based on existing properties, there was more space for original intellectual properties. You may have guessed though, but this was partly made possible by the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for the majority of the year, most of the movie theaters were kept empty, productions were heavily delayed, and any films that had completed their production had their release dates delayed by many studios who were reluctant to release them on streaming platforms or on demand, out of fear of losing money or ticket sales, piracy, and possibly jeopardizing their already fraught relationships with the movie theater industry. This also happened to be the first year for a very long time where we didn't see the release of a Marvel or Star Wars property. It was honestly encouraging to see audiences experiment with movies that they otherwise wouldn't have gone out of their way to see. I can definitely see why when someone is paying $14 for each ticket and an ungodly amount of money on drinks and snacks, they might not want to take the risk by watching something new that they may not like, and that's without considering the investment of time. Although to be quite frank, if you're not sneaking foods and drinks into the theatre with you, you're basically asking to be ripped off. There are thousands upon thousands of incredible stories that will never be heard because the market has made it so people have little to no interest in trying something new, due to being told that the latest offering from Disney isn't just the best thing that you could possibly see on the silver screen, but an event that you simply can't miss out on. Selling original movies to people is expensive and risky. For these studios, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a movie is, funnily enough, a safe bet. Sometimes. As remakes and reboots go though, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the time they simply don't work. Even if they bring back the original cast members, writers, directors, and whoever else, it ends up being the case where it can't capture the same feeling as the original. This is especially true for movies and television. I'm a huge fan of the sitcom Arrested Development, and I think its first 3 seasons are some of the best comedies ever produced, if you can look past the parts that haven't aged too well. And if you know what this means, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I and many others thought the show was cancelled far too early, but when I heard that Netflix was going to revive it for a 4th season, I was beyond excited. Unfortunately, it ended up being a letdown. Even though the original cast and crew returned, it just couldn't reach the same heights. And despite it having some great moments, it ultimately felt hollow. When they returned for season 5 and the show became a shadow of its former self, I just wanted it to end, and thankfully it did. But as they say, too much of a good thing is bad for you. There are rare cases where it can work out, like with the Breaking Bad movie El Camino, and even though it wasn't bad, I'm sure anyone that's watched it and the show would agree that when I say it didn't feel like it was a story that needed to be told, and we would have been fine without it. It seems to be the case that the only medium that's less prone to failure when it comes to reboots is video games. In the last few years, we've seen a slew of old titles that have been updated with modern gameplay mechanics and given a fidelity upgrade, but those aspects serve to enhance the player's experience by making the game more intuitive and immersive. A good example of this being Final Fantasy VII Remake, which compared to its 1997 counterpart is a completely different game, but it still manages to capture the feeling of nostalgia by breathing life into its world and characters, which were previously voiceless, blocky 3D models on top of a 2D background. Non-interactive media doesn't always benefit from these updates though. For example, there's a charm inherent to seeing things like the old special effects in movies, compared to what they are now. Audiences simply aren't impressed by photorealistic CGI anymore. So looking back and seeing the ingenuity that went into making some of the most iconic effects ever produced is so much more impressive than just thinking about how a horribly overworked FX studio rendered all the creases in Thanos' chin. It also is the reason why these blockbuster movies became such an important landmark in cinema. Star Wars: A New Hope wasn't expected to become the most recognizable movie franchise in the world, but because of how new and groundbreaking it felt, it found a place in the hearts of millions. The original trilogy was lightning in a bottle, and even though many blockbuster movies since have tried to recreate what George Lucas seemingly did by accident, instead we get clone after clone. Wars. To me, these blockbuster movies are like McDonald's food. You know exactly what to expect when you get a meal from there, from its taste to its appearance. You might even take some comfort in it, like eating a home-cooked meal by a loved one. However, it's also something that isn't new, or perhaps even challenging. There aren't any flavors which could potentially amaze or offend your tastes. It's just McDonald's. The food that you buy when you're on your way back from work and are too tired to cook but don't want to spend too much, and you know what you're getting into. I'm not trying to insult people for liking these movies, or even McDonald's for that matter. My point is that the safety blanket of movies designed by committee has created the circumstances in which creativity within the film industry has stagnated, and that's predominantly from our need to have our nostalgia pandered to. especially when it comes to the Star Wars movies, a series which aggressively panders to their audience's needs to have their fandom validated by including other irrelevant and sometimes nonsensical callbacks to previous entries in the franchise. One thing that's become all too common with the continuation and revivals of nostalgic franchises though is how they're reacted to, especially on the internet. Right-wing reactionaries are the first to complain about any updates or removals from these movies and these TV shows that remind them of how the world is a more progressive place than it was when these products were first released, such as if the producers decided to be more inclusive with their casting, or women being given more significant roles, or even if they're not as overtly sexualized as they once were. You'll see a lot of this pushback on YouTube because, obviously, it's clickbait and people flock to have their regressive beliefs validated by a personality who portrays themselves as an authority on the matter. A true fan, but it's a bit more than that. It's no secret that many of the film and television shows that were produced in the past had little to no concern about being inclusive. Like how in the original Star Wars trilogy, they were going from planet to planet, seeing all these different life forms, but for some reason there was only one black guy with a significant role. When The Force Awakens was announced, there was a backlash at the thought that John Boyega, a black man, could potentially be the new main character throughout the planned trilogy, and that by doing so it was seen as pandering to progressive audiences and the leftist agenda. Of course, it eventually transpired that Rey, played by Daisy Ridley, was actually a Jedi and going to essentially be the next Luke Skywalker, which absolutely everyone was fine with. Obviously, I'm kidding. It was even worse, and they spent the next 5 years complaining about her being too strong. The point is, though, that the inclusion of more modern and progressive ideas is a barrier for people like this, who believe that their thirst for nostalgia is tainted by the present, that they want the product that's identical to the one that was made in the past, where inclusivity and political correctness was barely factored into the production of these movies. Seeing their favourite franchise back in the movie theatre or on their TV screens is one thing, but to people like reactionaries, it's equally important that the media they consume reminds them of the time when they were younger and didn't have to contend with the world around them. Nostalgia is already a blindfold which helps you forget about the modern world, but in the case of reactionaries, they basically want a time machine that transports them back into their childhood, where they were forgiven for their ignorance, rather than now where they constantly have to come up with excuses for it. Movies aren't the only products that cater to our desire for nostalgia though. There are countless other properties which are based in past decades, mostly the 80s, an era which has become heavily romanticized by people who weren't even alive at the time. Whether it's shows like Stranger Things or Glow, the rise of the retro wave aesthetic, movies like Ready Player One, which worships the 80s to the point of being parody, and the dozens of revivals of movies and TV shows from the era. There's also genres like synthwave and future funk, music made with modern technology that's designed to be an homage to the music of the 80s, which personally I'm very fond of. In fact, I'm playing it in the background right now. Nostalgia doesn't exist just for the sake of the people who lived in the eras they were based in, though. Given how much past decades are romanticized, it's understandable that younger generations will become intrigued at what made it special, and it's become extremely popular, from the media to the overall style. Just look at how many young people dress in 90s era clothing nowadays, with flannels, baggy sweaters, and stonewashed jeans. By the way, hot take incoming here, but high-waisted jeans are hideous and always have been. I know I can't exactly speak, I mean, look at this, what I'm wearing, Fashion trends have been cyclical for a long time though. In the early to mid 2000s, the 80s made a comeback, as did the 70s, and I'm sure given enough time, the early 2000s will be with us, and God help us all when we start dressing like this. It's almost like we're in a time loop that we're really not trying to break, and the further we get into the future, the more eager we are to stay in the past. It's worth bearing in mind though that the past was not as great as many people believe it to be. The 80s in particular was an awful era. Countries like America and the UK destroyed collective power in exchange for individualist ideals thanks to Reaganism and Thatcherism. The Cold War was still raging, the CIA introduced crack cocaine to the black communities while funding Nicaraguan Contras in the process. The AIDS and HIV epidemic was completely ignored, costing the lives of hundreds of people, all because the government didn't want to associate with homosexuals. Sexism, homophobia, and racism were all alive and well. The hairstyles looked terrible, the fashion was mostly terrible, the cars looked like they were designed in Microsoft Paint with the line tool, the movies were bad, TV was bad, and before you say, well, the music was good, need I remind you that this is the same decade that brought you Don't Stop Believing by Journey. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. The 80s did have some good music, but in general, the decade sucked. And that's a fact that is heavily glossed over when people reminisce about it. You may watch a show like Stranger Things and think to yourself that things were so simple back then, but no, they were messy, complicated, and there were far greater monsters than the Demogorgon. The 80s in particular was also a time where people dreamed of what the future would be like. This came in different flavors too, like in Back to the Future 2, where Marty McFly visited 2015 and saw the amazing technologies that had been made, or there were more pessimistic dystopian portrayals like the ones found in Blade Runner. Interestingly enough though, both envisioned around the time when the world would be deeply entrenched in hyper-capitalist ideals, and no matter where you turned, you would be subject to advertising. The funny thing is, a lot of the things that we've seen in the movies from these eras actually came to fruition, and you could argue that they were inspired by them. Just think about it. We have super powerful computers in our pockets that can take photos and send messages, make video calls, play games, browse the internet, and more. I've also heard that you can make phone calls with them too, but being a millennial, the thought of having to call someone to make an appointment fills me with untold amounts of dread. We can control a bunch of devices in our households using our voice thanks to home assistants, robot vacuums that can map out and clean your entire house, order pretty much anything that you want online and have it arrive at your door within hours, and TV shows, music, and movies available anywhere you want, whenever, instantly. Despite all this though, we still pine for the past. Just consider the fact that people lament the loss of video rental stores. Blockbuster Video was a huge franchise at one point with over 9,000 stores around the world. But how many are left now? Just one, in Bend, Oregon, which stands as a monument to technological progress. As someone who got to experience these stores while growing up though, I have to admit I miss them too. When I was a kid, I used to love going to my local rental store on a Friday after school with my mother to pick out a movie or video game. It was exciting to discover new things, and even though in the modern times we have a far greater selection that's not only available to us instantly and cheaper, I miss that experience. Why? Well, when I was a kid, it was a time where whenever I sat down to watch a movie for a couple of hours, I didn't feel like I do as an adult, where I feel a pang of guilt because I can't shake the feeling that I should be using my time to do something productive. Let me ask you one thing. When was the last time that you did something like a Zoom call or played a video game on your phone and thought to yourself, wow, I can't believe I have this incredible technology in the palm of my hands for free? Probably never, right? If anything, you've probably thought to yourselves, this kinda sucks. That the quality of the video calls is shaky and laggy, and that the games you play on your phone and other systems are loaded with predatory features that are designed from the ground up to psychologically manipulate you into spending as much money as possible. I'm a big fan of fighting games myself. They're something I grew up playing and I still enjoy, but back when I was a kid, it was a case where all of the characters were included or unlockable by playing the game. But nowadays, if you want those extra characters, you have to pay for them. And by the time that they're all released, you can end up paying more than double, triple, or more than the original game cost. We live in the future, but for every incredible invention, there's always a catch, which makes it incredibly hard to embrace despite how amazing they may be. I don't think people can be faulted for being jaded with technology. As great as it is to have something like search engines that gives us access to more information than people in the past couldn't possibly conceive, it's disheartening to know that in exchange for this, we have to give up part of our privacy. We're all watched over by machines of loving grace, but the more we become aware of this, the more we want to hide from their gaze. It's also disheartening to see that despite such advancements, we keep being sold incremental updates for certain technologies every year, the biggest offenders being phone manufacturers. You may have heard this term already, but this way of producing products is called planned obsolescence, in which products are designed with what is essentially an expiry date. That isn't to say that they will stop working after a set period of time, but they will begin to underperform. And thanks to marketing, you'll be made to feel insecure about still having last year's model. The thing is though, this is completely unnecessary. Yes, technology is growing quickly, but do you really think that extra lens couldn't have been included on last year's iPhone? This method of marketing new technology basically validates you for buying the latest model, then only a year later makes you feel foolish for not waiting for the next. And in return for your impatience, you get operating system updates that slow down your phone, something that Apple admitted to doing purposefully to preserve aging batteries, a problem that wouldn't be a problem if they and other manufacturers allowed consumers to buy and replace batteries with ease. Smartphones can now cost you over $1,000, an insane price tag to say the very least, and it's beginning to feel like the more we spend on trying to embrace the future, the quicker we end up lagging behind because it'll never be enough. Phone manufacturers could release models that will last you much longer than they currently do, but they don't have to because that's not profitable. They're not the only ones guilty of this though. Car manufacturers do yearly updates, affordable clothing is lowering quality so it gets thrown away much faster. Many other electronics aren't easy enough to repair, and it's only recently that long-life light bulbs have become adopted as standard, even though we've had the technology to achieve similar lengths for hundreds of years at this point. This attitude towards technology has played a huge part in our journey towards climate catastrophe. All these old electronics and materials don't just disappear when we're done with them. With electronics in particular, they're either left in a gigantic landfill or their more valuable components are stripped, with the leftovers being burned, usually in some economically deprived Middle Eastern country, where the noxious fumes rise both into the air and the lungs of its citizens. Climate change is happening, and it's the fault of humanity and its endless need for consuming goods. Our way of living is unsustainable, and it's telling that between 1988 and 2015, only 100 companies were responsible for 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions, the majority of which being oil and coal producers. The world could be coming to an end sooner than we think, and that's a terrifying prospect, especially since there are so many people who still refuse to believe that it's happening or know it's happening and don't care. I think this is among the many reasons why younger generations love nostalgia so much. The present can feel like an unbearable place to live in at times, and the future seems so bleak that it's hard to envision it being anything other than a bad place. It's comforting to return to media from the 80s and 90s, where they had visions of the future that were so positive and hopeful of what's to come. And given that it's so hard to imagine a future that turns out well for us now, it's understandable that people want to look back at a vision of the future through the eyes of the past. The oldest millennials have just reached 40 years of age, even though boomers still think that we're in high school and vaping Tide Pods or whatever. As a generation, millennials have only 4.8% of all wealth. Around the same time, Generation X had 9%, whereas boomers had a massive 21% of all wealth. Millennials are the largest and most educated generation in human history, yet we're also the poorest, and it looks like that trend is going to continue with Gen Z. It is no surprise at all that younger generations feel powerless against the world, their government, their employer, and even their future, So I don't think people can be blamed for wanting comfort by revisiting the past, to feel like they did when they were a child, unaware of what's in store for them. I too miss the days where I could wake up on a Saturday morning, watch a few cartoons and eat a big bowl of cereal that's loaded with sugar, instead of this horrible menagerie of bran that I eat these days. I miss rental stores. I miss having no obligations. I miss being ignorant about how crappy the world can be. I miss Disney World. Nostalgia allows us to escape from the present and our future. You could argue the same for a lot of media, but nostalgia in particular is designed around hearkening to the past. It's a way for us to avoid reckoning with our current circumstances and, to an extent, our mortality. The future may seem like a daunting prospect as things stand, but although you might think I'm being a downer, I genuinely have hope in what comes next. As I mentioned a moment ago, millennials are the largest generation that exists right now, and eventually more of us will be in charge of making the big decisions. Thankfully, a lot of us do care about where things are heading. The circumstances that we've been given by older generations has emboldened young people across the world to take action and not be complacent. So when all those old politicians who are hell-bent on destroying the world inevitably die off, we can finally try to make the world a better place. It is frankly ridiculous that the people making decisions about our future won't be around long enough to see it happen. So that has to and will change. More people are becoming aware of how late-stage capitalism simply isn't working, and how becoming successful isn't simply a matter of working harder or grinding, and it definitely isn't a matter of working longer than anyone else. People have learned that the game is rigged, and it's even harder for marginalized people to come close to winning. As for the artistic side of things, people want new things. That's been proven over and over again, but instead we keep settling for comforting callbacks and mediocrity. There are so many new voices and stories that are begging to be heard. It's really time that they were given more of a chance. We all want a better future, one where we can truly enjoy our lives and not be filled with existential dread about what comes next. We want a world where technology can improve our lives without having to give away intimate details about ourselves. We want to feel as though things are fair and just, but as things stand, it can seem like the only way to emulate this sense of comfort is through the rose-tinted glasses of the past. I think like anything else, nostalgia is best enjoyed in moderation. It's easy to get wrapped up in the glory of the past. We can't forget that the future is coming, whether we like it or not, and it's up to us to solve the world's problems. You might be surprised what we can accomplish given enough time and effort though. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. I would also like to say thank you to all my patrons. As you can see, scrolling down here, these are all the wonderful people that offer in a little bit each month just to keep this channel going. I'd also like to give a special shout out to all of my patrons that donate $5 or more each month. That goes to Eleanor, Enrique Gutierrez, Eric Espinoza, Nathan Ferrin, Chris Smothers, Mergerger Fashionable, come on, Alina, hello, it's Leo, Jay's Reviews, Ratums, Mandy Spectre, Games, Martina, Sander Panda, Ashton the Platypus, CB Hart, Kevin Korber, Logan Roan, Sharfay, Nostracon, Lexi Weiss, Fraser, Mariam, Mickey Bonadonna, sorry if I got that wrong, Floof Pants, Tamara, my name is pronounced like Neve, Marius Stubberud, Your Sweet Pea, Catherine, and Steve Marr. Thank you all very much for your support. It really does mean a lot to me. You keep this going, and yeah, thank you. I'm also going to start reading out the Patreon question of the video, which I've started doing recently, so if you'd like to have something answered, you can do so by becoming a patron. This time I'm answering a question by GCU Grey Area. They want to know, I'd like to know how you're finding the healthcare system in the US, especially as a Brit. who can compare it to the NHS. Does it do anything better? No, to be quite frank. US healthcare, it's about the same in quality. The waiting times are about the same as well. You just have nicer waiting rooms and a big bill to go at the end of it. So no, US healthcare is a mess. And for the people that say that you pay for quality when it comes to US healthcare, no, you absolutely don't. Yeah, Medicare for all. Well, thank you very much once again. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will see you next time. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.